Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of Introduction to the Middle Way. I'm Alex Trezolio, and I'd like to start just by reviewing the first 3 weeks, just to remind us how we got to where we are right now. Firstly, what are we even doing here? Why do we need to establish the view? And the first reason is that we're here because we wish to liberate ourselves and all sentient beings. So our purpose of our study here is not academic. It's not to write books or to write PhDs. It's so that we can liberate ourselves and others. And that involves realizing the truth. And as Rinpoche has said many times, the truth can be expressed in terms of the 3 marks or the 4 seals. So once again, those are dukkha, suffering, or unsatisfactoriness, impermanence, anicca, non-self, anatta. But then in the Mahayana, we have the 4th seal, which is non-duality. And this is the truth, these 4. And wisdom, or prajna, is seeing or knowing this truth. And if we don't know the truth, or even if we know it intellectually, but it's not what's driving our actions, then we suffer. And in Buddhism, suffering has nothing to do with sin or punishment. It's merely to do with ignorance, with not seeing the nature of reality, the nature of the self. And so to end suffering for ourselves and for others, and to attain lasting enlightenment, we need to realize this truth, which means we need to establish and then realize the right view so that we have a path that can lead us to enlightenment. So that brings us to establishing the view, which is what we're doing now during this course of study. And the ultimate truth is non-duality. It's beyond words, beyond thoughts, beyond concepts. Can't be taught, can't be expressed. So we can't actually study that. All we can study here is the textual Madhyamaka, right? The finger that points towards the moon. As we saw last week, Jigme Lingpa said, as soon as we talk, it's all contradiction. As soon as we think, it's all confusion. So we have to acknowledge there's an irreducible amount of confusion that's going to accompany everything we do. And as Rinpoche said so many times, realization can only be accomplished through our practice, through our meditation, because our words, our thoughts, our language, that can get us as far as rational understanding, as dualistic understanding, but it can never take us beyond to non-duality. And Chandrakirti explains that he can't enter the sutras, the Buddhist teachings, directly. So he's going to teach based on the Shastras, and 2 in particular. One is Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamika Karika, and one is the Dashabhumika Sutra. And although it may seem like we're teaching ultimate truth, actually a lot of what we're going to be studying, we're already studying, is the post-meditation time of the Bodhisattvas on the Bhumis. And in particular now we're on the 6th chapter, the 6th paramita, prajna or wisdom, Tibetan sherab, meaning supreme mind. And what does this supreme mind know? It knows that any dualistic thought is not the supreme mind. And it wants to go beyond dualism to this non-dual. So we know that anything we look at as a temporary phenomenon cannot be the ultimate or supreme mind because it is changeable. And that's part of the reason that we're concerned about any of our opponents establishing anything as truly existing, because if you have a truly existing object, then by definition it must be duality that you're talking about. So what do we wish to establish as Madhyamikas? Well, in the ultimate truth, all phenomena are beyond extremes. Indeed, there is no arising. We cannot say there even are any phenomena. But in the relative truth, we accept the ordinary consensus of ordinary beings. And as part of this week's reading, Rinpoche emphasized the conventional truth. It's not a thesis, right? It's not like the positions of philosophers and theoreticians, because as we know from our own experience, as ordinary beings, our views change all the time. Right? One day we explain things one way, another day we explain it differently. We don't have solidly, firmly established views. So what we are going to do is we're going to refute theories of truly existing arising. Right? All the theories of arising from self or other or both or neither. Because if those are truly existing theories, then they are extreme views and not non-dual. So last week, week 3, we covered the Samkhya, arising from self, and looked at other arising in general. And this week we're going to turn to the Chittamatra school, now Yogacarya, which is a specific example, a Buddhist opponent of other arising. It's just a review of last week. I won't spend long on the self-arising, so that was verses 8 to 13, chapter 6. As Rinpoche said, it's not something that concerns us much in the modern world, because for most of us, when we think about causality or arising, we think that the cause and the effect are different, right? We don't think that the cause and the effect are the same, which is what you would need for truly existing self-arising. We're much more likely to fall into describing things in terms of other arising, right? Where we say there is a cause, like a seed, and a shoot, which is the effect in that case, or the result, and they are different, right? We say that a seed is different from the plant that it gives rise to. And so in the other arising, we're going to meet, and already have met, a number of Buddhist opponents. Just a review of what we covered last week. So verses 14 to 22, where our opponents were suggesting the possibility of truly existing other arising. Well, what does that mean? It means we have a truly existing cause, which gives rise to a truly existing effect. Just to remind ourselves, what does truly existing mean? Well, it means it is independent and it is unfabricated. I gave the example of thinking of billiard balls or marbles. That would be a good example of something that's true. Nice hard edges, clear definitions, doesn't change. Whereas we might say that something that's not truly existing, dependently arising, maybe we think of a cloud, something which is much more fuzzy, much more changeable. Even as you look at it, it changes. But a cloud is not good for a truly existing arising, because for something to be true, it can't change. It can't be changeable. And that, by the way, is why it must be independent, because if a phenomenon depends on something else, then it could change. And likewise, we want it to be unfabricated, because that way there's no fabrication or imagination or conceptualization that is going to affect this concept. It's not something that has been imagined or labeled or imputed by a theoretician. And so when Chandrakirti turned to this position, he said, well, we see that truly existing other arising is impossible. So firstly, it would mix up the order of cause and effect, because if two things, like two marbles, cause and effect are truly other, then things could arise of a different type, or they could arise unpredictably. So the logic of causality, of cause and effect, would fall apart, because there's nothing that would connect our two marbles. There's nothing that would ensure there is some order to the way they interact. A second refutation was in terms of time, because if we have our cause and our effect present at the same time, like our two marbles, then we can't say that one is the cause and one is the effect, because they're both there already. But if we don't have them there at the same time, then they have no contact. One marble can't hit the other marble. So if they're not there at the same time, how could cause lead to an effect? So our opponent is aware of these problems and suggested that we have a continuum. It's the example that rice seeds only give rise to rice shoots, never to barley shoots. But we refuted that by saying, well, that's a circular argument. Because really all we're saying is things in the same continuum cause results in the same continuum. So we're really just proving what we've just said. It's not actually any kind of proof. So we'll see that kind of argumentation come up again today, right? Because with the Chittamatra, a lot of the challenge is going to be they believe in a truly existing subject, namely mind or consciousness, but the object, they would argue, is not truly existing. So we'll see a lot of these kinds of problems will confront them as well. But just in passing, Rinpoche also said, look, when we talk about theories, and I noticed this, by the way, several of you asked questions during the week, it's interesting that when we are grappling with this text, our own counterexamples come from our own experience, right? So we might say, well, an acorn gives rise to an oak, an embryo gives rise to a baby. Where do we draw the boundary? There is no hard boundary. How could we say these things are truly other? And yes, that's fair, but see, the point is once we're doing that, we're now arguing with Chandrakirti. We're taking his own position, right? We're saying there is no such thing as a hard boundary around these objects. So we're no longer taking our opponent's position. I think, as we said last week, it's actually very difficult to find a coherent way of talking about a truly existing other arising. Now, well, that's all very well in theory, but of course in practice, as soon as in our lives there are things that happen that we don't like, or things that we cling to, we very suddenly become eternalistic. Right? If someone steals our money, we don't generally think in terms of causes and conditions coming together. We don't tend to think of all things being compounded and impermanent. We tend to think we're victims of a crime, and a truly existing crime at that. Right? We solidify, we cling. So again, it may seem obvious that these things cannot be realistic in the world, these ideas of true other arising, but unfortunately our theory in use, our actual mindsets that drive our action, they haven't yet caught up with our view. Our view isn't yet firmly established. And as we've said repeatedly for the last 3 weeks, establishing the view is critical. We need to know what is the right view, but 98% of the work is practicing the path, because it's one thing to know something intellectually, but it's another thing for it to be realized, internalized, embodied through one's being. Okay, so the next big idea we had last week was the two truths. And as you may recall, this came from a question that our opponent asked. They said, well, Chandrakirti, you say that you accept ordinary people's view of conventional truth, and yet you're trying to refute other arising, when most ordinary people, as we've just said, would say that cause and effect are different, and effect comes from cause, and it's other. So to answer this, we set up the idea of the two truths. Bear in mind, the two truths, they don't truly exist. They themselves are just another convention, another useful boat to cross the river, which we shall abandon. We're not saying they're ultimately there. The conventional truth, we're saying, it's not a thesis, right? It's a means of communication. It's something we need to know, we need to be true, because we need to be able to use the language and talk to ordinary beings, but that doesn't mean we accept their theories of what is ultimately true. And by the way, most of them don't actually, as we just said, they don't have theories of what is ultimately true. Most of their ignorance, their clinging, their attachment is fairly implicit, fairly intuitive. They have a sense that here I am, I have a self, and then I cling to this self, me and mine and all those things. But yeah, it's often not really established through any kind of logic or reasoning. And we also learned that we do need to realize both the ultimate truth, that things are completely beyond any kind of extremes of existence, non-existence, both or neither. And in the relative truth, we just accept the conventions of ordinary people. Because if we don't realize both, we'll end up with an extreme view. And most typically, we'll end up, like most of our opponents, with something truly existing in the ultimate truth, which is a form of eternalism, and then denying something in the conventional truth, which is a form of nihilism. Right? Whereas for Chandrakirti, the two truths, as you showed last week, means you don't have these extreme views. And the other thing is, in all this confusion about how do we explain causality, especially over time and space, for Chandrakirti, he has no problem because he has no truly existing cause, and so there is no truly existing end to his cause. So there's nothing that he needs to connect to the result because all of his causes and all of his results arise dependently anyway. It's not as if there is an end or a firm beginning to any of them. So as Rinpoche said, more on the two truths. A lot of it is that our experience doesn't match up with what the teachings say is true. Right? We may know intellectually that there is no truly existing self, but we don't feel that, right? We feel, hey, I'm really real, I'm here. And what we know intuitively doesn't match up. And so what do? Well, either we ignore the theory, or else we have to conclude that our feelings must be in some way wrong and unreliable. Of course, this is very tough, because we've been repeatedly told, trust yourself, trust your feelings. It's pretty much the main song of every Disney movie. Right, so part of our challenge is, are we going to follow our feelings, or are we going to follow the truth? And that's always difficult, right? Because the intuitive move will always be to go with our feelings, to go with our gut. So as we said in week 1, it's very important for us to really develop the view, to establish the view for ourselves. So it doesn't feel like some external set of rules, but it's something that we can understand and believe and then internalize for ourselves. And so again, back to this mismatch. What we feel may not match up with what we know to be true intellectually, but rather than focus on the discrepancy, the two truths comes at it a different way. It says, well, ultimately, there is a truth of how things are in reality, and then conventionally, there's a truth that corresponds to our feelings, our reality. As Rinpoche said, it's like relationships, like conflicts. And whenever there's a conflict between two people, there's what actually happened, who said what, who did what, and then there's the truth of each person's experience. And we all know, because we've all done this, we can take things the wrong way, we can take things personally, we can perceive an intention that wasn't actually there, and thus feel bad or upset with another person. Or sometimes we feel good, right? Sometimes we may have assumed that someone has been attracted to us, when in fact that wasn't the case at all. Right? So we're always imputing this kind of intentionality to others. And so a big practice, even in the contemporary world, is separating the behaviors from our interpretations and feelings, right? Separating the truth of what actually happened from our personal subjective experience. So again, there's always this sense of an objective and a subjective. Maybe not exactly the same as the ultimate and the conventional, but I would say very closely related. I have a story here. I sound very English. Indeed, I grew up in England, but I was born to an Italian father and a German mother. And so I don't know if you know much about the difference between the Italians and the English, but one thing is how they communicate. So in Italy, it's always a source of great ebullience, energy, people talking over each other, very extroverted, high energy kind of feel to a conversation. Whereas in England, it's considered polite to listen carefully and wait till someone has finished speaking and then speak yourself. And so, if I were to say in England, I would say, well, if you interrupted me, if that was the truth that I observed, my subjective experience would be, well, I'm very upset because it means you didn't listen carefully to me. It means you weren't actually paying attention. So I would take that in a very bad way. Whereas in Italy, if you interrupted me, I'd say, fantastic. It means you're really excited, engaged, enthusiastic. So there you see how you can have the same truth perceived very, very differently by two observers. And this is something that is happening everywhere in our conventional world. Now, so the first aspect of the two truths is we have an ultimate truth and a conventional truth. Now, there is a third element we discussed last week, which is the conventional truth is the valid relative truth, right? It is where there is a consensus among ordinary beings. We also identify the idea of an invalid relative truth, right? When, for example, if somebody has taken too much alcohol or drugs, or if they've got some kind of eye disease where they see falling hairs, because in that case, their perception would not be the same as the perception of other conventional beings, right? That would be an invalid conventional relative truth, not conventional. And what Chandrakirti is going to say, or has already said, is all our opponents, their theories of true existence, their theories of true arising, they are invalid relative truth, right? They're not conventional truth, because not only are they positing an ultimate truth that conventional people don't agree with, they're actually, as we'll see, because of their theories, denying some aspect of the conventional truth. So an example we gave last week was, if a person says, oh my goodness, I just broke one of my favorite wine glasses, a materialist might say, that doesn't matter, you didn't break a glass, it was just a bunch of atoms. Now that's an example of a denial of the conventional. I just wanted to add one other example here, which we'll come back to actually in week 8. It's a lovely story about what's called the Stockdale Paradox. It's a story of Vice Admiral James Stockdale, who was the highest-ranking American military officer to be captured and held in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. He was held for 7 years in a prisoner of war camp and suffered almost intolerable conditions, torture, sleep deprivation, all kinds of things, but survived. And when afterwards was asked, how did he do it? He said, you need to do two things. He said, I always did these two things. One, you have to face current reality, see the truth, right? Don't deny it, don't hide from it. Admit to yourself very honestly, this is what's going on. But then also to have confidence that you will prevail in the end. So again, not exactly the same as the two truths, but a very similar notion that there's a part of you that needs to be focused on the truth of my current situation, and there's another part that's very much around possibility, optimism, compassion, what could be, hope, faith. And I think it's a good invitation for all of us as we look at that balance in ourselves. Do we veer towards focusing a little too much on the reality with not enough optimism? Or do we focus a little bit too much on the optimism and not really pay enough attention to the reality? Because either of those will be an example of not practicing the two truths. Now, one other important point that we came across was this idea of any provisional truth is not ultimate, right? And so it's untrue in some respects. As we said, all the teachings, all the paths, all our language, all our communication, as Jigme Lingpa said, is in some way faulty. And even the teachings themselves, yes, we know that the emptiness teachings are seen as the highest, they're seen as pointing to the ultimate, and all the other teachings, right? teachings on compassion, teachings on the paramitas, teachings on kindness and patience, teachings on Buddha nature. All these things are provisional. Right? They're seen as just a means to lead us to the ultimate. But we must never, as Rinpoche emphasized, we must never look down on the provisional as being worse. Right? Because it's all about what is skillful, what is useful, what is the right path that can lead us to the right view. Because if we teach the wrong path, even if it may be true, it's not going to take us in the direction of the truth. We'll give up, right? So there's a nice Zen story here on skillful communication. It's called Time to Die. Ikkyu, the Zen master, was very clever even as a boy. His teacher had a precious teacup, a rare antique. Ikkyu happened to break this cup and was greatly perplexed. Hearing the footsteps of his teacher, he held the pieces of the cup behind him. When the master appeared, Ikkyu asked, "Why do people have to die?" "This is natural," explained the older man. "Everything has to die and has just so long to live." Ikkyu, producing the shattered cup, added, "It was time for your cup to die." So we saw last week, Rinpoche and J. Cole, we talked about the three different kinds of students, right? Some can hear the truth at once, some need repetition, and some won't be able to hear it until they've had more life experience. Another question is, what to teach someone? What is the best? Well, likewise for ourselves, what practice is the best? Rinpoche often talks about the difference between the forest glade and the charnel ground. Now, if you go back to the Pali Suttas, you'll see the Buddha talks about an ideal meditation spot as being away from the chaos and the distractions of the city, and in the forest find a quiet, secluded place to practice. And indeed, that's very beneficial, especially if we're easily distracted, if we're beginners. And yet we also know, the tantric practitioners, they consider the most auspicious place to practice is a charnel ground, where traditionally it was believed it's full of all kinds of spirits and strong energies and very distracting forces. But if one was a stronger practitioner, then the forest glade is not going to help one move forward with one's practice. It's a bit like skiing, right? As a beginner, you want the most gentle slope, right? The greenest of the green runs. If I were to give a beginner a black run straight away, they'd fall over and probably break a leg. But for somebody who's an advanced skier, if you make them go down a green run, it's one of the most frustrating things, right? It's boring, it doesn't test their skills, it doesn't help them develop their skills any further. So we need the right kind of path for the right person. And even last week we saw, to whom should emptiness be taught? Very different for different kinds of people. And for some people, yes, those, for whom tears come to their eyes and their hair stand up on edge when they hear about emptiness, for them, yes, we should teach directly. But for many beginners, much better just to teach a gradual path. So a big part of this is also, not fooling oneself. Right? We need empathy and realism for ourselves. And for beginners, Rinpoche's number one practice advice actually comes from one of Milarepa's songs. He says, "My religion is not deceiving myself and not disturbing others." Right, but this not deceiving myself is very important. Now, what counts as a higher path in Buddhism is the extent to which it really reveals non-duality directly. The more we directly teach non-duality, that's considered higher. The more we, talk in a very indirect way, that's considered lower. And as Rinpoche once said, you could talk about the whole path as saying the non-truly existing person follows a non-truly existing path to attain a non-truly existing result. And that is true. But who could understand this? Rinpoche even said, the Buddha, all he actually needed to say was, "You are all Buddhas." It's true. But again, most of us, we'd have no idea what that means. It just wouldn't touch us. And it's because of that that he has to teach the 84,000 paths, as Rinpoche said. That's a sign of the Buddha's tremendous compassion. But I think, especially now in the West, I think it's very popular, I think, we like this idea that we only want the best. And so everyone says, oh, I want Dzogchen, right? I want Mahamudra, Mahasandhi. But unless we have a really deep understanding of emptiness, if we think we're practicing Dzogchen, no, it's going straight over our heads. We're probably just practicing shamatha, if that. Right? So much of so-called Western Dzogchen really is just shamatha. Similarly with Vajrayana, right? A lot of people, they love to sort of refer to non-duality to justify all kinds of excesses. They say, yes, in Vajrayana it's allowed. You can have meat, alcohol, sex, wealth, whatever you want. And indeed that is true, right? There's nothing about the Madhyamaka view that says those things are bad. But practically, do you really realize that view, or are you just gratifying your ego desires? And Rinpoche often says, the easiest way to tell is just do the opposite. Try just eating rice and dal for 6 months. No sex. Live in poverty. Wear the same second-hand clothes every day. Beg for your food. Can you truly say you have no preference? Well, if so, then maybe then you could say you're ready for these other tantric practices. But if you still have an ego preference and then you're just giving into that and making an excuse to have meat and alcohol and sex and money and all the rest, well, then that's not practicing Dharma. That's just, as we said last week, that's just spiritual materialism, right? That's just using Dharma as an adornment for your ego. Now, I know many of us are very busy. It can sometimes seem impossible to do the study or the practice that this requires. And traditionally, Rinpoche would emphasize renunciation and motivation at the beginning of each teaching. And indeed, I think that's something several of you have asked for, and we should do. So even though I haven't done it, I'm hoping the practitioners amongst you are doing it yourselves when we're starting. You know, as Rinpoche says, take time to establish, or as he puts it, to tune our motivation. And I really like that idea of tuning, to make sure, are we off key, or are we really in tune with the idea that all we're about to do is not just for our selfish or conventional needs, but really it's for the purposes of liberation of all sentient beings. So often when he teaches these teachings, he will, at the beginning of each session, chant the Heart Sutra. So if you're not doing that, maybe before these webinars or before you study, you could do that. That's strongly encouraged. Actually, it's also encouraged, Rinpoche has invited people to do this as well, to actually write out the Heart Sutra. I mean, even better if you can do calligraphy in whatever language you can speak. But yeah, just writing it out, chanting it, just engaging with the Heart Sutra is considered very meritorious. And again, when he taught this in France, every couple of days, he would start the teaching with a long session on Lojong, on mind training, right, to remind us the importance of renunciation, overcoming our worldly ambition and clinging to the 8 worldly dharmas, right, reminding us not to get caught up in all that, because it's true, if we're just going to be focused on our samsaric goals all the time, we won't put in the time to study this or to practice this. So again, I'm not going to do that now, but I would invite you, perhaps during the week, to spend some time reflecting on these Lojong teachings, to spend some time reflecting on what is your motivation, and how are you spending your week, and how much time are you making to really engage in the study and the practice of these teachings. Because if you're not making time, you have to ask yourself, what is it for you that has higher priority? And is that really what you want? Okay, so turning now to week 4, it's a summary of what we're going to do. Before I even summarize the content, I would say I really want to encourage this week a mindset of humility. A couple times in the text, Rinpoche, in conversation with Ugyen Tobyo Rinpoche, they were saying, at times when we think we have defeated the Chittamatra. We might dance and think that we have won. But as Shantideva says, that is like when a crow meets a dead snake and the crow dances like a Garuda. As you may know, the Garuda was the most majestic and fearsome of all the birds. And the crow obviously thinking that, or liking to pretend that it's actually accomplished something. And I think that's actually a pretty good example, because for any of you who spent any time with the background reading, and if you haven't, I strongly encourage it. I put several articles that gave some background on the Yogacarya, the Chittamatra. And you'll see several things, right? Firstly, it's not as if there is a single sub-school of the Chittamatra, right? Their thinking evolved from Masanga and Vasubandhu, who founded the school in the 4th and 5th centuries, all the way to Shantarakshita in the 8th century and beyond. So even in India, there were many different interpretations of what mind-only meant. And then turning to the West, well, not just the West, but actually the Indian, Tibetan, and now Western commentators, they have a very, very wide range of different philosophical interpretations of what the Chittamatra actually meant. And in particular, there was quite a radical shift starting in the 1960s, where until that point, Western commentators had primarily seen this as a form of idealism. But then after the 60s, it was much more seen as a form of phenomenology. So all this to say, we don't have a single understanding of who our opponent is, or what they mean, or how we should interpret them, right? So let's not jump to conclusions that we think we even understand them, let alone that we've refuted them. I think this is another element that Rinpoche talked about, which is just arrogance and pride. And he said, page 200, he said, we may engage in these debates and we may even feel we're winning, but don't start to develop this mindset of we, the Madhyamika, are the best. Right? Don't develop that kind of pride, because actually despising other paths is breaking one of the major precepts of the Bodhisattva. But also, by contrast, don't give up, right? Don't think this is too difficult. Don't say, oh, I can never do this, because that's also ego, right? That's a narrative. That's a form of ego showing up as resistance. Well, there's a third aspect, right? Don't think you're too sophisticated to engage in practice, or that practice is somehow irrational. At page 210, he said this. Is Buddhism a philosophy or a religion? Well, I mean, you could argue that question itself is very dualistic. But as Rinpoche said, Nagarjuna and the Madhyamika tradition says, for someone who accepts emptiness, everything is acceptable. And here he pointed his criticism towards a lot of contemporary Buddhists, especially secular Buddhists. For any of you who've read Stephen Batchelor with his Buddhism Without Beliefs, or what Rinpoche likes to call the British Buddhists, Batchelor wants to reduce Buddhism to a form of secular rationality, right? And I think we would say he is confusing the irrational with the beyond rational, the non-dual. So he cannot accept religious methods or seemingly religious methods. And like Vajrayana, he will say that's a form of irrational theism, rather than seeing it as a skillful means that can take us beyond rationality to realize the non-dual. Right? So he's definitely not accepting everything like a Madhyamika would. So in other words, he must have some form of truly existing view which is making certain things unacceptable to him. So in that sense, he becomes an opponent of Chandrakirti. Now, we'll return to this in week 7. Now, having said that, even though the Chittamatra is very complex, we can't necessarily identify a single position. There is one thing which I think is common to most of the, if not all of the schools, which is the idea of a truly existing mind without object. And so here, they would say, our opponents, we have a truly existing subject experiencing an object that is not truly existing. And there was actually already some criticism of this from the pre-Madhyamika schools, right? The Vaibhashika, the Sautrantika. And they would ask, well, if there is no truly existing object, what grounds a perception in space and time? First question. Second question, if there's no object, why do different people see different things? What gives rise to that? And then how can we have imaginary objects, if there's no object, that give rise to actual results, right? We're very familiar with the idea that we can think something, but it leads to real action in the world. So how can something which doesn't exist be causally efficient in this way? We'll come back to that. Now, a lot of what we'll see today is Chandrakirti's refutation. We'll say, look, if we have an object that doesn't truly exist, then clearly the subject, which is truly existing according to the Chittamatra, doesn't need that object, right? So why don't all subjects experience the same things as this subject that happens to have this non-truly existing object? So for example, if we say a person has a certain dream experience, they might dream of a giant elephant. Well, if that elephant doesn't exist, it's equally non-existing during the daytime, so why don't we perceive the giant elephant in the daytime? And we'll see that our opponent comes up with actually a variation on this idea of a continuum that we saw before. Actually, this week we'll talk a lot more about the idea of a potential or a seed. But basically, it's the same kind of problem, trying to link together a truly existing cause with an effect, right? Because when they're truly existing, we cannot create that link. Okay, so as with previous weeks, I just read the 10 bulls. I'll read 2 this week and also next week. So number 4, catching the bull. I seize him with a terrific struggle. His great will and power are inexhaustible. He charges to the high plateau far above the cloud mists, or in an impenetrable ravine he stands. Comment. He dwelt in the forest a long time, but I caught him today. Infatuation for scenery interferes with his direction. Longing for sweeter grass, he wanders away. His mind still is stubborn and unbridled. If I wish him to submit, I must raise my whip. Number 5, taming the bull. The whip and rope are necessary, else he might stray off down some dusty road. Being well trained, he becomes naturally gentle. Then, unfettered, he obeys his master. Comment. When one thought arises, another thought follows. When the first thought springs from enlightenment, all subsequent thoughts are true. Through delusion, one makes everything untrue. Delusion is not caused by objectivity. It is the result of subjectivity. Hold the nose ring tight and do not allow even a doubt. So, I think this week we'll start to get the sense perhaps that we are starting to master the bull. We'll be starting to feel a sense of, mastering the refutations. We were in the hero's journey. We're now in the very middle of Act 2, sometimes called the promise of the premise, where we're being tested, our opponents are tough, but we are winning the fights. We're beginning to become confident that we'll prevail. We're starting to have fun. In this case, we're starting to see that other arising can be refuted, our refutations work, and perhaps we're even starting to understand why. Okay, so turning to the text. Just a brief introduction to the Chittamatra view. You'll see it's called both Yogacarya and Chittamatra. They're sort of interchangeable. Just the actual, what do the words mean? Yogacarya literally means one whose practice is yoga. Chittamatra means mind only, where chitta means mind and matra means only or exclusively. Historically, this came later than Nagarjuna, right? So he didn't refute this in the Mula Madhyamika Karika, so one of our source texts, which is one of the reasons that Chandrakirti is spending so much time on them as an opponent, right? Because the previous Madhyamika tradition has not really disposed of them fully. Our other source text, the Dashabhumika Sutra, interestingly, that's also a source text for the Chittamatra. Right, so it'll be quite interesting and quite challenging. Just in passing, I know I said a moment ago that we're not entirely clear what the Chittamatra believes, or that they believe just one thing. And we're going to make an assumption here that they believe in truly existing other arising. But it's not even clear that the Chittamatra actually believed that. If you look at Wikipedia on Yogacarya, they say, it's very helpful, they say, as evidenced by Tibetan sources, this school was in protracted dialectic with the Madhyamaka. However, there's disagreement among contemporary Western and traditional Buddhist scholars about the degree to which they were opposed, if at all. Summarize the main difference. While the Madhyamaka held that asserting the existence or non-existence of any ultimately real thing was inappropriate, some exponents of Yogacarya asserted that the mind, or in a more sophisticated version, primordial wisdom, and only the mind is ultimately real. But not all the Yogacaryans asserted that mind was truly inherently existent. And according to some interpretations, even the founders, right, Vasubandhu and Asanga in particular, did not hold to that interpretation. And so, actually, this notion that we currently have, that they are in opposition, was expounded by Xuanzang, the Chinese monk, in the 7th century, when he had some debates with the Madhyamaka school in India, and wrote in Sanskrit a treatise no longer existing called The Non-Difference of Madhyamaka and Yogacarya. And actually, later Yogacarya exponents synthesized the two views, right? Particularly Shantarakshita in the 8th century. His view is called the Yogacarya Svatantrika Madhyamaka by the Tibetan tradition, where he's saying, yes, ultimately we follow the Madhyamaka, the idea that all phenomena are beyond extremes, right? No existence, non-existence, both or neither. And at the same time, in the relative, we like the phenomenological focus of the mind only. And we'll see, even more so next week actually, that there's a lot of overlap between the Chittamatra and contemporary phenomenology, cognitive science, philosophy of mind. And a lot of the debates in philosophy of consciousness around the third person versus the first person. And you'll see this with Francisco Varela, the Mind and Life conferences, Alan Wallace. There's a lot of this going on. You know, is our first person consciousness real, or is it empty? You'll hear these philosophers use terms like qualia, the hard problem, and so on and so forth. So I put up some readings for next week. But we're going to dig into some of this next week when we look at the lack of true existence of the person, and in particular, the lack of true existence of subjectivity, right? Because a lot of us, when we say the person, we're referring to the sense that here I am, right? You know, the Cartesian cogito ergo sum. All right, so verse 45, page 159. On the sixth bhumi, the Bodhisattva realizes that phenomena are mind alone. This is what the Chittamatrans argue. And worth noting, they would also say emptiness, but they would define it a little differently. Whereas for the Madhyamaka, we say empty of true nature. For the Chittamatra, it's empty of labeling. It's not the same. Because for them, the base of labeling, as we'll see in a moment, does exist substantially. Whereas for us, the Madhyamaka, nothing exists substantially. So the example they use, very good example, just as the wind stirs the ocean to make waves, our habits stir the alaya, which is our consciousness, our mind, to produce all our dualistic phenomena and experience. Now, of course, the danger with that analogy is it implies there actually is an ocean there, right, which is being blown around by the wind, whereas in fact, as we will see, there is no truly existing alaya, even though our opponents would like to believe there is. Okay, verse 47. Now we come to the definition, and the definition is in terms of three natures. Now, the Chittamatra still hold to two truths, right? Everything is either phenomena, as in Dharma, or ultimate reality, Dharmata, which is the nature of phenomena. So, you know, there's three natures. There's only two truths, just like us. And the theory is what's called representationalist, right? So That means you can't access phenomena directly, only their representations. And just to look at our previous opponents, so the Vaibhashika, they are realists. They believe in these atoms and moments of thought, but not representationalists, because they believe you can have a direct perception of these real objects, these atoms. At the Sautrantika, the next school, they also believe in the atoms of matter and of mind, but for them you cannot have a direct perception. You can only have access to a representation, right? Something that's caused by the external objects. And by the way, when we say representation, it's very similar to how contemporary neuroscience would describe things, right? We think we see the world, but what's actually happening is our eyes are taking in the stream of information, converting it to neural impulses, which are going along our nerves to our brains, and our brains are then reworking all those neural impulses and constructing an image. And we're not seeing the image directly. We're seeing a representation, a construction. It's a virtual reality. And the same is true in the Sautrantika and also the Chittamatra, right? But the difference is in the Sautrantika, the representations are caused by external objects. In the Chittamatra, these representations are not caused by anything external, right? They're caused by subliminal impressions, right? Vasana or bakchak, from the foundational consciousness, right? From the alaya vijnana, this thing we're calling the mind only. So just a moment, what are these vasana, these bakchak? Again, Wikipedia is very good if you look at the article on vasana. They are habitual tendencies or dispositions, a word that's often used synonymously with the word bija, or seed. Right? It's found in the Pali and the early Sanskrit sources, but really comes to prominence with the Yogacarya, because they're using this term, this idea of this habitual tendency or seed, to denote a latent energy resulting from actions. Right? So it's like if we engage in certain actions habitually, it's thought to become imprinted in our mind streams. Right? They actually call this alaya vijnana a storehouse consciousness. Right? It's almost like a bank account which stores all our karmic traces. And it's believed that these habitual tendencies predispose us to particular patterns of behavior in future. Right, so it's a bit like that. They're like a stain, almost like a coloration of our mind stream. For example, it's assumed that if someone smokes, there'll be a habitual tendency for that urge to smoke to keep coming back. The idea is that if we behave in a certain way, it'll trigger similar actions in the future, thereby reinforcing these bakchak. Again, very similar to contemporary neuroscience, where there's this adage, neurons that fire together wire together. Right? We know that repeated behavior tends to solidify our way of thinking and our way of acting, right? Which is part of the reason practice, even Dharma practice, is effective. Right? It's because we're kind of reinforcing our habits. It's very similar, actually, again, Thich Nhat Hanh, who we talked about last week, he has lovely language about this, where he talks about watering the seeds of sorrow and watering the seeds of joy, making the point that at any moment in time you can choose, am I going to put energy into the things that make me unhappy, or am I going to put energy into watering the seeds of joy, the things that will make me happy? Because the more we water the seeds of sorrow, the stronger they become. And likewise, the more we water the seeds of joy, the stronger they become. Very similar example to the classic Native American story, which often is quoted. The idea that there are two wolves, and there's a good wolf or a noble wolf and a bad wolf. And the wolf that becomes the stronger is the one that we feed the more. That's a very similar idea, right? Where we put our energy, the wolf that we feed, the seeds that we water, those become strong. Right? So I think actually the Chittamatra idea, very intuitive, makes a lot of sense, and actually fits with contemporary neuroscience, right? That habits are real, they're physical in our brain, and the more we do a certain thing, the more we have these, what we could call it, karmic traces. Okay, so the three natures. There are two that are in conventional truth and one that is ultimate. So again, two truths. So the first one in the conventional truth is parakalpita, Sanskrit, or kuntak, and that is all our dualistic experiences and perceptions, all projections, all interpretations that we're making of the underlying seeds, which are the mental phenomena. Parikalpita, as you may recall from previous weeks, that's a word we use, which is the same word for imputed reality. Right, so for the Chittamatra, that includes all our normal imputed dualistic phenomena and experiences, but also things like language, right, where we've come up with a conventionally imputed system. And to our minds, they appear, all these phenomena, as if they have an external dualistic subject-object reality, a duality. But this is completely unreal, right? None of this truly exists. All of it is just like a superposition on the base, right? So it's a bit like we talked last week, the Uttara Tantra teachings. It's like having dirt on our window. So the window is the base, but we can put dirt on top, and it's very similar to that. There's often an analogy used that sometimes in a dark room, we might have a striped rope lying on the floor, and if we're unsure, we might project a snake where there's actually a striped rope. So in this case, the striped rope is the base, but the snake is this parakalpita, that kuntak, right? It's the projection, the imputation. There is no snake there in reality. We are adding it based on our habitual patterns, right? It's invalid relative truth, because other people, if they were to look at that rope, they would not see a snake, they would see a rope. That's the first nature, right? The second nature is Paratantra in Sanskrit, or Zhenwang in Tibetan. And this is the base, right? The base of all these projections. So just like the example of the striped rope is the base of the projections of snake. And it's called the dependent nature, right? It's mind, but actually consciousness, really, because it's not the dualistic mind. Everything dualistic is a projection, right? That's part of that first category, right? The kuntak, right? The Zhenwang is a non-dual awareness, right? Sometimes we say mere clarity, mere awareness. And here the Chittamatra say, look, it's devoid of duality. Nevertheless, it exists substantially and is completely beyond words or language or expression. But for them, it is considered to be conventionally real, right? As we said before, the imputations, the parakalpita, that's conventionally unreal. They don't accept it. It's completely unreal. Whereas this, they need some kind of conventional reality. For them, the conventional reality is this Zhenwang, this base. And now perhaps already you can start to see, wait a second, this is starting to interfere with the cowherd's perception, because no cowherd would describe conventional truth this way. And actually, the striped rope, it's actually, I mean, yes, it's a common example. It's actually a little bit misleading because the striped rope is already dualistic, right? It's already a particular perception, whereas this base should be something that is non-dual. So there's another example we'll come to later, which is the way that different beings in the six realms perceive water differently. And actually, ultimately, Chandrakirti will say there is no truly existing base, but humans see it as water, fish see it as a home, the hungry ghosts, the pretas, they see it as pus and blood and excrement, right? So different beings make completely separate projections onto this base, which is beyond duality. In fact, there is no base at all truly existing, according to Chandrakirti. But for the Chittamatra, yes, there's a base, but it's beyond duality, right? So that's a good way of thinking about it. So just to be clear, for all the lower Buddhist schools, the Vaibhashika, the Sautrantika, the Chittamatra, there is a truly existing base. And that is why we talk of other arising, right? Because our subjective experience, it is based on this truly existing objective base. That is the cause of our subjectivity. Whereas for Chandrakirti, there is no truly existing base, right? So there is no truly existing other arising. The third truth, the third nature, is the ultimate truth, and this is called Paranispanna, or Yongdrup in Tibetan. And this is ultimate reality. Little complicated, because they, like like us, as the Madhyamika would say, the ultimate truth is emptiness, right, beyond dualistic existence or appearance. But I'll read the quote from Vasubandhu. So the literal translation, he says, the paranispana is the eternal non-existence, in other words, it's never truly there, of the as it appears, in other words, the kuntak, the projection, of what appears, in other words, the base, because it is unalterable. It's a little hard to follow, but what he's saying is these projections, right, the kuntak, they are always non-existent, right? There's never a truly existing projection, whereas the base does truly exist, right? And so what we're saying in ultimate truth is that projections are always unreal, whereas the base is unalterable and truly existing. And that is the ultimate truth. Okay. There's some more detail which we touched on a little. Just this idea that even the Zhenwang, right, it actually has two kinds. It has a pure and an impure version. And actually this is progress along the path, because in samsara, as we've just described, we have all these seeds, these imprints, these dualistic karmic habits, which are causing the Zhenwang to manifest for us as dualistic phenomenal experiences, right? It's impure Zhenwang. But if we practice, we can replace these impure seeds with pure seeds, right? So we'll change the storehouse, right? What's actually stored in our alaya vijnana, and all of a sudden we'll move towards a pure Zhenwang, right? And so that idea of the purification of the Zhenwang is what the path is about. Right? It's replacing the bad seeds with the good seeds, right? The seeds of sorrow with the seeds of joy. Okay, so refutation. Now, the Chandrakirti's text doesn't actually talk so much about the early Buddhist schools, but some of the pre-reading touches on this are quite helpful, I think. And the early Buddhist schools, they challenged the Chittamatra by saying, look, if you've got no object, how do you ground your perception in space and time? And here the Chittamatra answer with the example of the dream. They say, well, yeah, look at a dream. In a dream, the person is or appears at a specific place and time in the dream. Right? It is grounded. The next question, well, why do different people see different things? Again, here the common Buddhist example is used. Just as you said, water appears differently to different beings on the different realms. Humans see water, fish see home, the pretas see pus and blood and excrement. And this intersubjective agreement is due to the maturation of their collective karma. Right? So Buddhists accept this conventionally. So again, why would you argue with us, say the Chittamatra? Final example, how can we have a causally efficient object that is nevertheless not truly existing? Here the example is a wet dream, right? Even without sex, you can still have the emission of semen, right? Because of a fantasy during your dream, right? So you could have a real effect even though the cause is not real. So what will happen is Chandrakirti basically does not buy this idea that you can have a truly existing subject or consciousness without a truly existing object. And so he presses the Chittamatra, like, well, give me an example, right? And so they successively go through 4 different examples, right? They're all actually good Buddhist examples, but none of them, it turns out, actually work. And by the way, they would all work if the Chittamatrans did not insist in true existence. But because they're insisting on truly existing arising, that's what makes this not work. So the 4 examples. Starting in verse 48, we have deluded mental consciousness, or the dream. Verse 54, we'll have deluded sense consciousness, which is our old friend, the eye disease of falling hairs. Verse 69, mistaken meditation. So this is the classic Theravada meditation, the corpse meditation, the skeleton meditation. Finally, verse 71, we'll have deluded perception. And this is the example we've already discussed, which is the different perceptions in the different 6 realms. Okay, so Chandrakirti says, okay, give me an example. And our opponent says, well, the dream. Because, we have a truly existing mind. We know that because we remember our dream, but the dream didn't exist. But, Chandrakirti is not happy with this. He says, well, what makes you say that the object was not truly existing, but the subject during the dream was truly existing? Why was the subject not equally not truly existing? Or to put it differently, why doesn't the dream object appear to the waking mind? Right? What's different? There has to be something that's different, because as far as he can say, in the waking mind, both the mind and the perception are both conventionally accepted, they're both conventionally real, but in the dream mind, the dream object, they're both conventionally unreal. So, it's verse 49. Verse 50. Here the Chittamatra is going to say, look, there is no object. So they talk about three things. They talk about the object, they talk about the I, sense and consciousness, and then they talk about the result, the mental representation. And for Chandrakirti, all three are equally not truly existing. But for the Chittamatra, the first two, the object and the I, they are not truly existing, because remember, all of these dualistic appearances are manifested as kuntak, right, as projections on top of the Shenwang. But for them, they would say the actual mind that perceives this, the mind itself, is truly existing. And Chandrakirti cannot accept that, right? So basically the next couple verses, 51 to 53, they're all basically saying, look, there cannot be a truly existing subject with no truly existing object. So in 51 he says, look, if you say the object and the I do not exist, how can something real, right, this mental representation, arise from something non-real, non-existent? Makes no sense. 52. So these are actually, as Rinpoche says, the verses themselves are actually very, in a way, they're very simple, because really all he's doing is just challenging this idea of how real and unreal could be in that kind of subject-object relationship. Because as far as he's concerned, you could either have both real or both unreal, but the idea of having one real and one unreal makes no sense, right? Remember, go back to our idea of the marble, the true existent, interacting with the cloud. It doesn't work. I mean, a marble can hit a marble, or you can talk about two clouds merging together, but a marble and a cloud, how does that work, right? It doesn't make sense. 52, Chandrakirti says, look, just as there is no truth in the cognition of the dream object, there's equally no truth in the cognition of the waking object. There's no true existing mental representation there either, no truly existing consciousness. 53 says the object, the I, and the mind, the consciousness, they're all similarly not truly existing. Whereas, as we've said, the Chittamatra says the mind truly exists, but not the senses, not the objects. So, they claim they have a non-dual theory, but for Chandrakirti, this is extremely dualistic, right? We have a dualistic sort of breakdown between a truly existing subject and a non-truly existing object. So very similar to a lot of the contemporary cognitive science debates about the first and third person. We'll come back to that next week. What is the status that we're ascribing to the subject, to our consciousness? Okay, so now 54, we move to the second example, the deluded sense consciousness. And again, as we said before, if we have an eye disease, we see falling hair. But for Chandrakirti, this is easy to refute. He says, look, either you have the eye disease, in which case you both have the object, you see the object, and you have the mental representation of that. Whereas if you have no disease, neither exists. Right? So again, the opponent still hasn't managed to come up with an example where we have one, namely the subject, but not the other. 55. Chandrakirti says, well, look, if indeed you could have a truly existing subject that did not have an object, then why doesn't everyone see falling hair? It's similar to the previous refutation of why doesn't everyone see the dream elephant? Why doesn't everyone see the falling hair? We have no reason. And so, of course, in 56, now the Chittamatra, they have to resort to some reasoning to explain why these subjects should be different, given that there is no truly existing object, right? Remember, Chandrakirti doesn't have this problem because he doesn't have a truly existing subject that is separate from these objects. For him, subject and object arise dependently upon one another. And so naturally, in different circumstances, you'll have different subjective perceptions. Of course, Chittamatrans can't do that, right? So they need some kind of explanation. And in this case, they talk about the mental potential, right? The bachak, the seeds. They say, well, the reason the supposedly healthy person doesn't see the hair is not because there's no hair for them, but just because their mental potential, their seed, hasn't ripened yet. Chandrakirti does not like this, and so actually very similar to the refutations that we had last week. He's going to refute this idea of a seed or a potential by asking on which time does this seed exist? Is it in the past, the present, or the future? And he says, well, it's 57. If it's in the present, we don't need the seed, right? Because we already have the result. So in the same way that if we have a shoot already present, we don't need the seed, right? If it's the future mind that has this seed, well, the future mind doesn't exist yet, so we can't talk about the characteristic of something non-existent. Now, that can't actually give rise to anything later because it doesn't even exist. And then if we talk about the seed being in the past, well, then we have the same problem as in verse 14, that things could arise without coherence, anything from anything. So in verse 60, Chandrakirti concludes, look, the Chittamatra idea of this continuity, this seed, this potential, this has already been refuted just as before, just in verse 16. It's a circular argument. Right, at 61, he then points out there are some additional problematic consequences. When we say things are other, and yet we say they're part of a continuity, that doesn't make sense, right? You can't have things that are truly other sharing a single continuity. Again, if you find that hard to visualize, just imagine again the two marbles. The two marbles, you can't sort of overlap them like you might two clouds. Marbles have hard edges. They cannot share a continuity, right? Where one marble is, the other marble cannot be. They can't overlap, right? So same with anything truly existing. It cannot overlap. It cannot share this continuity. So now 62 through 64, again, the Chittamatra now restates their thesis, but this time in terms of the support and the object supported, right? The base and the object, Janwan Kuntak. So they say, 62, the I, actually, this idea of an I, is just the potential, the habitual pattern of the alaya vijnaya, which has been activated. And so as a result, ordinary beings project dualistic phenomena like I, like the object of the I, on something that is fundamentally non-dual. It's just a non-dual seed or movement or vasana in the alaya. Likewise, 63, these sense objects do not exist. 64, there are no truly existing forms, right? Just as in a dream we might see a dream elephant, even though there is no real elephant, and that would be arising from the maturation of these seeds, these karmic tendencies, this bhakchak. Similarly, anything else we perceive is the arising, the maturation of this kind of seed. Okay, so the refutation, we've actually covered this already to some degree. So 65, Chandrakirti here says, look, the dream, you see forms and yet there is no I. So why don't blind people see things when they're awake, right? If it's all coming from the mind. At 66, he reverses the argument and says, if the blind person doesn't have the potential to see while awake, why should the healthy person see things when dreaming? By the way, if you, I noted the translation here on page 179 is actually different from the Padmakara translation. So I would actually advise, if you have the chance, to follow the Padmakara one. I know Rinpoche recommends that as the most accurate translation we have. The commentary in the Padmakara on this verse says, since neither external objects nor sense powers exist in dreams, there cannot be just consciousness existing in isolation. And it must be accepted that just as in the waking state, objects such as forms and the sense of sight and so on in the dream state are the causes of, or the occasion for, the false mental consciousness, namely the subject. Okay, so in 68 then, conclusion, all the Chittamatran arguments are basically unsubstantiated hypotheses, right? They're hypotheses that are the same as the thesis to be proved. They're circular arguments. They're really not proving anything. We still haven't got an example, a valid example of a truly existing subject without an object. Nevertheless, they haven't given up, so we turn now to 69. Third example, deluded meditation. All right, so here, this is the classic example of a yogi would meditate on the skeleton, on the earth being covered with bones. And indeed, with such a meditation, the yogi can transform his or her consciousness and thereby achieve non-clinging, right, renunciation. So here, our opponents, Chittamattra, are saying, well, look, we all know there is no skeleton covering the earth in reality, and yet we have a truly existing change in our mind that results from this not truly existing object. So what are you going to say, Chandrakirti? How do you refute that? And here Chandrakirti says, well, no, look, that's not truly existing. That's also dependently arising, because if indeed this was a truly existing mental representation, then it should be like a theater. It should be that everybody should see the same thing. But we know that's not true, right? It's only the case for the person who's done their practice. Okay, that's verse 70. The fourth example, verse 71. Deluded visual perception. So again, we've already seen this idea. Different realms perceive water differently. And here, Chandrakirti in the last two lines, 187, says, just in brief, if there is no object, then there is no subject, right? There is no consciousness. Because as before, if it were truly existing, we should all see it. And clearly we don't. Each of the realms sees something different. But here he turns now to refuting this Zhenwang, this base, this alaya. He's refuting its true existence as a subject, a substance, sorry. Because it says in 72, well, who could know it, right? It's not an object of mind. We've already said it's completely non-dual. It is not an object of anything. And so how can anyone perceive something non-dual? Because as soon as you were to perceive it, it becomes an object, right, of perception. And then our opponent says, well, what about truly existing self-awareness? But that doesn't work, right? If our self-awareness perceives itself and it's truly existing, then we have the same problem we saw last week as with the Samkhya, right? Of truly existing self-arising. So again, that's very much thinking wrongly of Buddha nature as being like Atman. It's very important for those of us, who are, aspiring to practice, Mahasandhi, Mahamudra. This idea of the mere clarity, the mere awareness, that should never be truly existing, right? Because otherwise it just becomes like a form of Hinduism. Again, another attempt, and the Chittamattra says, well, what about the self-awareness remembering its early experiences? But here Chandrakirti says, well, look, memory itself is not proven to be real. And so we can't use it as the valid proof of self-awareness, because who knows? Other things might cause memory, right? We don't know. And in 74, he says the other problem is the past memory and the present experience, they are other, right? And as we said last week, if things are truly other, for truly existing other arising, then you have all these problems of linking cause and effect, not having a chaotic breakdown where anything could lead to anything else. So all of these problems still with us, with our opponent, I should say. And so then 75, well, how does Chandrakirti then understand memory? And for him, no problem, right? Because for us, we do not have truly existing arising, right? So the mind or the memory that remembers something blue, it's not truly different, not truly the same. There is no true statement we can make about its relationship to the object blue. We know there is a mind, we know there was the object, we know they are existing in this complex, dependent relationship with one another. But there's no true arising, right? So there's nothing to explain there in terms of a true causality. So summary, starting in 76. There's no true existing self-awareness, so there is nothing that can perceive this Zhenwang, this dependent nature. 77. And if Zhenwang is neither born, well, because our opponent here insists it's unborn because it's truly existing, nor is it known because it can't be perceived, then Chandrakirti says, well, surely its existence is totally illogical, right? Something unborn and unknown. And he sarcastically says, what did the barren woman's child do to you that you're not using that as your example? Because again, obviously the example here is a barren woman obviously cannot have a child, right? So here Chandrakirti is saying this is truly not existent, right? Unborn, cannot be known. And why is that any different then from your alaya? And as we've already seen, because the Chittamatra believe the Zhenwang truly exists, they end up destroying the conventional experience of ordinary people. Because remember, they've already argued all of these outer phenomena are not real. The only thing that is conventionally real is this Zhenwang that we can't even talk about or perceive. So clearly not conventional experience. 79, a very important verse. The first two lines, which I'll read the whole thing. Apart from this very path of the Venerable Acharya Nagarjuna, other paths will not serve as means to attain peace. In other words, enlightenment. As they incompletely grasp the all-concealing, in other words, relative, and absolute truths, they fail to establish liberation. That's a very strong statement. Right, we're basically saying, even though other Buddhist schools may all say they're working to enlightenment, as we saw last week, only the Madhyamaka, only the practice of Madhyamaka is actually the path to enlightenment. And indeed, even the Shravakayanas, the Pratyeka Buddhayana, those other Buddhists are also practicing Madhyamaka if they are moving towards enlightenment, right? So all these other Buddhist theoreticians, all these different schools, their beliefs are not a path to enlightenment. Very strong statement. Verse 80, sort of building on this. Conventional truth is the means, absolute truth is the aim. Whoever's unaware of this distinction will enter inferior paths because of wrong conceptions. Right? So either we get the wrong goal or we get the wrong path. But unless you have the right goal, unless you have the correct understanding of the ultimate truth, and unless you have the right path, in other words, the correct understanding of conventional truth, you will not move towards your goal. Right? And as we've seen, for us, we have neither fault, but for our opponents, they have both faults, right? They are asserting something truly exists, so their goal is incorrect, and they're interfering with the conventional truth of ordinary beings, so their path is incorrect. Now, there's also, because our opponent has said, well, surely Zhenwang is a conventional truth, but here we reject any similarity of Zhenwang and conventional truth, because Chandrakirti says, look, he does not accept, nor do ordinary people accept, this Zhenwang or alaya in the ultimate or the relative. And he says even when it comes to accepting conventional people's opinions in the relative, he only admits these non-existing things exist for the sake of convention. And he said, indeed, if phenomena didn't appear to ordinary people, he wouldn't even talk about them. And here the example is, well, look, for arhats who have attained nirvana, for them they no longer have phenomenal appearances. Right? Although, of course, for beings until that point, we do still see phenomena. So Chandrakirti is saying, look, I am in agreement with ordinary people. I'm not going to argue with their perceptions if that's what they see. So in 83, he says, look, ordinary people, they contradict the denial of relative conventional truth, right? He says, try debating ordinary people, and whoever wins, I'll rely on the stronger. A lovely argument, right? And very consistent with his view. He says, look, Chittamatra, you debate these guys. If you can convince them, then fine, I'll follow you. But frankly, I doubt that you will. I think it's a great reminder, as Rinpoche said, a great anti-nihilist verse, because it just reminds us we cannot ever let our Dharma path ignore or deny the importance of family, work, relationships, health, responsibilities in the world, right? Sometimes we can, allow our Dharma path to become nihilistic, but this verse reminds us that is a mistake. In the conversation, actually, the Q&A, there was a nice point made that why is the Chittamatra other arising? It's because the self is a label, right? All labels are not truly existing, so it cannot be a truly existing arising from self because the self doesn't exist, right? So it has to be a truly existing other arising. By contrast, as we saw, the Hinduism, the Samkhya, there the self does truly exist, which is why we have truly existing self arising. Right, just to be clear on that point. Okay, so now verses 84 onwards, actually they're a little more straightforward, because this basically is saying, why was the Chittamatra view taught in the first place? If indeed on the sixth bhumi the Bodhisattva sees that it's all mind, why would we get sort of, why wouldn't we just go with that, right? Why do we need to worry about the emptiness teachings being ultimate and the Chittamatra not being valid? Why was the Chittamatra taught at all? Okay, so 84. It was taught to refute a permanent self as the creator, right, as we saw, like Samkhya, or indeed schools that believe in a creator God, right? Here the Buddha wants to say, no, none of these external things create, only the mind. 85. It was taught to overcome these wrong views. 86. Because the Tirthakas, right, the believers in wrong views, they taught other kinds of creators like Atman, like God, which the Buddha wanted to refute. Hence, he taught mind-only. But 87. But he was not doing it to deny form, only to establish the importance of mind. And 88, just to be clear about that, in other places, the Buddha does talk about the importance of action, right? He doesn't just talk about the importance of mind, so he's not going into this kind of idealistic ignorance or denial of action. 89, but why is the mind so important? Well, because all the six realms, all sentient beings, they come from karma, and without mind, there could be no karma, right? 90, form itself is inanimate, right? It's only mind that is the creator of karma, and therefore the creator of the six worlds, the six realms. And the big difference is, unlike the Chittamatra, Buddha did not refute the existence of the external world. For him, if you have mind, you also have form, and vice versa. So thinking otherwise is contradicted, right? 91. Because the ordinary beings see the five skandhas, whereas the yogi sees none, right? So we cannot have a truly existing form or substantial form. But likewise, in the ultimate truth, if there's no form, no object, there's also no mind, no subject. So either both are equally refuted, ultimate and conventional, as in the Prajna Paramita, or both are accepted, right? The mind and the form, like the Abhidhamma. Or we're explaining conventional truth. Whereas the Chittamatra, what they do is they keep one and reject the other. So in this way, 93, all these substantialist opponents, Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, they're all dismantling the two truths. 201, we have this lovely quote from Guru Rinpoche. Our view should be as wide as the sky, but our attention to the details of action should be as fine as the tsampa, the barley flour. And that is the statement of the two truths. So just continuing, there's a bit of a discussion about the scriptural authorities, just saying that in this case, the supporting text is of expedient meaning, so drangdun, not certain meaning, or nirdun. And as we said already, the mind-only teachings were taught especially for those who have a strong attachment to form, which needs to be demolished, refuted. 95, Chandrakirti says, look, in other sutras, the Buddha himself said, I teach different medicines for different sicknesses, and for some I taught all is just mind. And why would he say that if this were not just provisional teaching? As we said before, just because it's provisional does not mean it's inferior, right? Provisional is about useful, because if we don't have the right teaching for us at this point in time, we will not move forwards, right? As Rishi said, actually, part of what a skillful teacher will do is he will decide for a student, do they tend to veer more towards the eternalism or more towards nihilism? And then he'll decide what kind of teaching they need, right? If they're more eternalistic, they probably need more deconstruction, more emptiness-oriented teachings, right? Whereas if they're nihilistic in their tendencies, then maybe they need more compassion or bodhicitta or Buddha nature-oriented teachings, right? So 205, this lovely saying of the Buddha, which is, mind, there is no mind, the nature of mind is luminosity, right? Those three statements correspond to the three turnings of the wheel. And there was a discussion here, I'm not going to go into much detail, and you can certainly read more in the background reading if you're interested. And this is really amongst the differences between the different Tibetan schools, the Rangtong and the Shentong. The Rangtong basically say only the second turning teachings, right? The teachings on emptiness, only those are certain teachings, and the third turning is provisional, whereas the Shentongpas, they would say both the second and the third turning are certain teachings, right? There's a nice story actually on page 206 about when His Holiness Dulkens Rinpoche went to visit His Holiness Dijum Rinpoche, who basically said, yes, just a reminder, when establishing the view, it's wonderful to have the Rangtongpa, right? More emptiness-oriented, very clean, no chance of falling into misleading, hiding places for the ego. But once we have established the view, then it's beneficial to practice with the Shentongpa, right? A little bit like Stockdale's Paradox, right? It's good to get a clear understanding of the truth, but then we need something to motivate us to practice, to keep going on the path, right? It's easy if you're just focused on deconstruction, focused on emptiness, you might lose hope. You might wonder what the point is if indeed there is no meaning and no purpose. Another nice analogy given here, which is like the mother with a sick child, right? Normally, of course, we would say it's very good for the baby to have the mother's breast milk, but if the child is sick and cannot take the milk, then maybe the mother for a period has to put something bitter onto her breast, so the child does not want that. But then once the child's sickness is healed, the mother puts something sweet back onto her breast to encourage the child to drink the milk. So similar here, right? The milk, right? The teachings on the Shentongpa, the Buddha nature teachings, they give us this inspiration, this encouragement to practice like the mother's milk. But at the beginning, they can poison us because we already have too much attachment, right? So first we need to take the bitter medicine and to not sort of drink this milk too much. We have to instead drink, something different and establish emptiness. But then once we have done that, once our view is in place, then as we practice, the Shentong is considered very, very beneficial. Okay, 96. Just also, why did the Buddha teach the emptiness or a lack of true existence of phenomena first? Because then it's easier to disprove the true existence of the person. And indeed, as we said last week, that is the order we're doing it in this text. Again, just a repetition, 97. Any sutra, any of the Buddha's teaching that does not teach emptiness directly is considered provisional, including, as we said, anything on Buddha nature, etc. And that is the end of arising from other, right? Arising from both self and other, just one verse, in 98. And really all Chandrakirti says is, look, all the defects already identified would occur. Because if it's both, you've got all the problems of self arising, and if it's other, you've got all the problems of truly existing other arising. So 99, we then turn to arising from no cause, right? Neither self or other. And verse 99, if that were the case, causality would break down completely, right? If there's no causes, how on earth does any cause lead to any kind of result? Anything could arise from anything. Why would we perceive any phenomena, right? Because there's no rational reason, there's no causing of anything to appear or to function in the world. So clearly absurd. Right, then there's a slightly different school of Charvakas in 101, which is Charvakas that believe in an elemental cause. These are extreme materialists who see all phenomena just emerging from different configurations of the material elements. Actually, some would say this is similar to contemporary materialistic scientists. And there's a very interesting debate that happened in France, if you read through the transcripts here. Because for ancient Indians, the verse 101 says, how could somebody with such thick mental obscuration even probably know what is beyond this life? In other words, if you're that much of a materialist, how you wouldn't even be able to imagine rebirth. And for ancient Indians, of course, this was a source of ridicule because for them, rebirth was very much part of their contemporary truth, conventional truth. Whereas, as you know, nowadays we have secular Buddhists like Stephen Batchelor who do not accept a rebirth, right? Because they argue the conventional truth in the contemporary West does not have a rebirth. So there's a really interesting question here, which Rinpoche asks as well. How can we bridge this gap between cultures like ancient India or Tibet, where rebirth is conventional truth, and cultures like the modern West, where it isn't? And this is especially a challenge for us if we're following Chandrakirti, because for Chandrakirti, he accepts conventions. And so if the convention is there is no truly existing rebirth, why would we believe it? I'll leave that for you as a contemplation. How would you resolve this dilemma? Maybe a topic for a forum discussion. By the way, I just want to have a shout out for the forum. It is now fully functional, and I know already some people are active, but I know there's many of you following these teachings, and only a very small number are actually engaging in the forum. So I just want to encourage you, use it. You don't necessarily have to participate in existing topics if you don't want to. Maybe start new topics, ask questions, raise your doubts, and just work with each other, comment on each other's thoughts, answer each other's questions. It's really there for you as an opportunity to use it that way. Okay, 102. Yes, I mean, if indeed you see the self as an object, then you do have this problem that you're having a truly existing end, truly existing ceasing of a truly existing self, right? That which could indeed be a criticism for an unsophisticated modern materialist who doesn't believe in time arising. 103, because as Chandrakirti says, the elements themselves, we've really shown, like all phenomena, the elements, they do not have truly existing arising, so they do not truly exist. So how could these elements, which don't truly exist, give rise to a truly existing self? Makes no sense. Right, so the very idea that you could have a truly existing self, a truly existing phenomenon that does not come from any causes, makes no sense. Right, 104. So here we're disposing of a few objections. Just repeating 104. There are no truly existing objects, but to ignorant sentient beings they appear deceptively. 105, really important point. It's not as though there is some kind of true nature that is being blocked, right? It's not as if there is a base that we are perceiving incorrectly. According to Chandrakirti, there is no base, right? No truly existing base. So dualistic phenomena themselves are the ignorance, right? Just like the water, the six realms, there is no truly existing base that could in principle be seen correctly. It's not as if one of the six realms has a privileged or correct view of this supposed phenomenon. It's that all of the six realms in samsara are all mistaken. Right? That's why we talk about going beyond dualistic perceptions, because they're all mistaken. Right, again, certainly if you were using the language of science, you might say any model of the world we know as an approximation. There is no right model. Any model is wrong. It's just this idea, just getting used to this idea that any story we tell is incomplete, right? Any dualistic perception, that is the ignorance already. 106, like 42 actually, we did last time. The unwise still engage in creating good karma and bad karma. The wise go beyond good and bad and are liberated. Actually, a little later in 230, Rinpoche clarifies this verse, saying, he often gets the question, how can it be that good things like faith, like devotion, like compassion are considered to be ignorant? And just as we've been saying all along, remember, what we're interested in is realizing the non-duality, the truth, the absolute ultimate truth. And all of the path, right, all of these path teachings, all of these methods are just like the boat for us to cross the water. Right? We're not wanting to get attached to the boat. Right? We don't want to get attached to any of these good methods which are our path. Just always remember this, right? As a Madhyamika follower, non-dual is always better than good. And I think that can always be a challenge for us, right? Because I think in our conventional thinking, our conventional morality, we always think we need to do what is good. So we always have this confusion again between the two truths. How do we make sure we are keeping to both the ultimate truth, focusing on the path to the non-duality, and at the same time not contradicting conventional truth? So just a few more refutations. Here our opponent attempts to refute us, saying, well, look, 107, if there's no arising in the relative truth, like you say, Chandrakirti, then why do I get a headache? Just we saw this last week in the Zen story, nothing exists. Why, our opponent says, why isn't your lack of true existence just the same as the non-existent barren woman's child? Why is there anything at all? How do you explain it? So it's 108. So first Chandrakirti says, well, first argue with those who experience all these falling hairs, and then you can argue with ordinary sentient beings. Right? His point is, very hard to refute people's perceptions. They really believe this is their experience. Then 109 he says, look, why are you getting so hung up with this idea that you need true existence in the first place, right? We all understand the idea that we can perceive a non-existent phenomenon like a mirage, right? Just because it doesn't exist doesn't mean you can't perceive it, right? So you clearly don't need something to be truly existing in order to perceive it. Right? So in 110 he basically says, therefore your objection doesn't hold. And in fact, in 111 he says, the barren woman's child doesn't exist ultimately or conventionally, and all phenomena are like that. 112, hence the Buddha said that all phenomena are primordially peaceful, uncreated, and naturally beyond suffering. Now, I like this word primordially peaceful, especially although when Rinpoche teaches the Four Seals, he'll often say nirvana is beyond extremes. He also sometimes says nirvana is peace. It's the same idea. There's something about non-duality that is intrinsically peaceful. So 113, here example is, the lower Buddhist schools, the Vaibhashika, the Sautrantika, they will say that a composite object, like a pot, doesn't ultimately exist. But nevertheless, it exists relatively, right? Even though the ultimate existent is this atom, which many are collected together to make the pot, but they're not denying the pot, right? So as Chandrakirti is saying, just because you say something doesn't exist does not mean it's like a barren woman's child, which doesn't even exist conventionally, right? So that was the opponent's accusation in 107. So Chandrakirti refutes that. So now in 114, another important verse. So this is the first time where Chandrakirti actually uses the word dependent arising. So having now rejected all the four possibilities of true arising from self, other, both, or neither, what is left is that there can be no true arising. But because we don't deny that things appear conventionally, we then accept dependent arising. And again, I said this already, but just a handy way of thinking about this is when you think of truly existing or true arising, you're thinking of billiard balls, right? Hard edges, clear boundaries, can't have two in the same place, same time. Whereas dependent arising, we don't think of billiard balls or marbles, we think of something like a cloud. Fuzzy edges, unclear boundaries, unclear beginning and end, always changing, right? And so again, for our practice, it's always good to think, when you notice your emotions, when you notice your conceptions, what is the narrative you're telling, right? Is your narrative more like a cloud or more like a marble? So again, if somebody accidentally scratches your car, do you accept this as a cloud-like impermanent conditioned phenomenon? Or do you think of your car as being something that should be pristine, unscratched, always perfect, like the marble? And of course, as we've seen, intellectually it might be easy for us to sort of talk about everything being dependent, but when it comes to our emotions, especially when things which is regarding theories of me or mine, then we become quite marble-like, right? Quite billiard ball-like. All of a sudden things have hard edges. We find it quite hard at that point to accept the four seals, the impermanence, the suffering nature, the lack of self, the non-duality. So 115 then, well, what are the benefits of understanding dependent arising? Well, it cuts through extreme views, 115. 116, it cuts through conceptions. These are very straightforward stanzas, so I won't go through them really. But I like the end of 116. It says, without the firewood, you will have no fire. It's a very nice image there that if you don't have a truly existing idea of self, no me, no mine, then you won't get the fire of the three poisons. 117. Yogis are freed by going beyond all thoughts, beyond all virtuous and non-virtuous. So again, very similar to 42 and 108. 118, an important verse. Chandrakirti is saying, look, I'm not engaging in all this debate and refutation because I happen to love polemics or debate. I'm doing it for the sake of liberating people who currently have wrong views. And he says, look, if in the course of that other views fall apart when analyzed, it's not my intention, it's not my fault, right? So it's really important. He's pro-enlightenment. He's not anti these other schools. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that because we use the language throughout this text of talking about our opponents. We talk about debate. We talk about winning and losing and defeating. But that tends to conjure up a very dualistic mindset, which makes us think our job is to, defeat these schools. It's not what we're trying to do here, right? All we're trying to do is liberate beings. And yes, if in the course of that, if in the course of pointing out wrong views, they fall apart, so be it. But that's not our aspiration. And 119, makes that beautifully clear. Clinging to one's own view and equally assailing the view of others, such are limited attitudes. Therefore, when first clinging and hatred have been cleared away, analysis will bring liberation. So really important always to remember as we're engaging in this text, because sometimes I think you can get excited by this journey. As we said, the hero now has the capacity to defeat his opponents. We can start to think it's all about the fight, all about this defeating people. That's really not what we're doing, right? It's not our ultimate purpose. Okay, so with 119 then, that marks the end of the refutation of the truly existing self phenomena. And as we saw, we ended up with ultimately there's no true existence, and relatively we can speak of things arising or appearing dependently. So, for next week, if you read the rest of this week's reading from 236 onwards, you'll see there's quite a debate on, rebirth, on next life, on what does it mean to have a self, to have a mind. And at the time, Rinpoche said, look, because we were coming to the end of the 1998 teachings, he said, you have a year now to prepare for our next set of debates, which is going to be, debating the true existence of the self. Now, in this case, we only have a week, but I do encourage you, because there's a lot here of contemporary interests, of contemporary theory of mind, philosophy of consciousness, a lot of the mind and life work, the first third person work, a lot of how we think of ourselves, how we relate to ourselves. So just taking time to clarify whatever narratives or theories we might have, whatever beliefs we might have, I think that'll be very helpful as we then come to the refutations next week, right? Because we'll have more of a sense of what our own habits might be. And with that, I thank you once again, wish you a good night, and I will see you next week.